MyFantasySportsTalk.com.
How you doing, podcast peeps? We're back. It's your guys from MyFantasySportsTalk.com with another My Fantasy podcast. I am one of your hosts, Brandon Reed. My co-host is Dan Shaw. Dan, today we're going to be joined by Ryan Thomas and talk about fantasy football in an article he published, which immediately got some criticism because it's a little wacky.
I like out-of-the-box thinking when it comes to fantasy football rankings. I mean, I think you get that every year in the preseason when I release my rankings. I take some chances, and I usually hit on those chances. Sometimes I miss, like Jameis Winston last year. But, you know, I have my fair share of hits. And Ryan Thomas is a different cat. Literally, he loves cats. And if you ever listen to his podcast, Thomas Take Sports Podcast, good stuff on there, but he's a little crazy. And we're going to talk about the article that he brought out. I'm very high on the guy that he would take number one overall. But if you listen to our fantasy football rookie show, or actually it was in the mailbag segment where we rank some top four fantasy football running backs, this guy was not mentioned in that group. That included David Johnson, Todd Gurley, who else? Ezekiel Elliott, and Le'Veon Bell. So,
to be fair, a viewer asked us to rank those guys, but still, yes, the guy who wrote the article on wouldn't even be in that top 4 or 5.
Yeah, well, I would actually probably have him ahead of somebody in that 4. The guy that I was low on, I think you were pretty high on him, Le'Veon Bell. So I do understand the hype surrounding this player, but number one overall, you would need to do some serious convincing, and I think that's why Ryan Thomas is going to come on this show to try and convince us why we should take this guy number one.
Well, there we go. So let's bring him in, Ryan Thomas from the Thomas Take podcast, to talk about it. But the article in question is up on the site right now, MyFantasySportsTalk.com, from Ryan Thomas. It is titled, with the first overall pick, the Thomas Take selects. And I really think this guy is probably more of a, well, depending on the size of your league, a late first, early second. I really think he could slide to second. I'm high on him too, but we talk about some of those guys that we mentioned, and I'm not putting him above any of those guys. So we'll talk to him in just a second. But we also got a couple of questions, so we're going to kind of combine fantasy football talk, a special guest in Ryan Thomas from the Thomas Take podcast, and mailbag questions on this segment. So this one's going to be big. We've got a comment about the article, and we've also got an interesting way to wrap up the back end of the conversation on today's podcast with ranking some fantasy quarterbacks. We did running backs last time. We're going to do quarterbacks on today's show. So that's going to be big fun. Can't wait. And I got a surprise for you, Dan, on one of my quarterbacks and how the season's going to go for him. So just a little
I think I already know, and it's tomfoolery is basically what that is. I think Ryan is probably rereading his article right now. That's why he doesn't want to join us right away. Who knows? But when it comes to his fantasy talk, he has a nickname besides the Catman. Champ. I don't know if you caught that one. He calls himself Champ when it comes to fantasy football. So maybe you should take his advice, and you could be a fantasy champion like I was in our MFST league this year. Do you remember that, Brandon?
I do. Yeah, you won the second year after I won the inaugural year. Yeah, I won't let you forget that. But good job. But the guy who hasn't won a title yet, and he talked about in the article, year 3 being the big year for fantasy football. Is when you finally build your squad, you get things together. So year 3 for the league for this guy, Ryan Thomas, is going to be your year, right?
That's what they say. Year 3 is when everything comes together, right? Year 3. Third time's the charm.
I don't know who's saying that, because I ain't saying that. Dan probably ain't saying that. So I'm sorry. You got your work cut out for you. I don't know what you're trying to peddle here, but
There's nothing to. I'm just making excuses for the previous 2 years. That's all it is.
Yeah, I know. So your article came out. Talk about the article just for a second that was released, I think last week sometime. But anyway, with the first overall pick, the Thomas Take selects, and then get into the article and tell everyone at home who that mystery player is, who you're talking about, what the whole piece is about.
Sure. So the article that I wrote in regards to who I would take first overall, I kind of gave people a little bit of a background as to who I am. It had been a little bit of a stretch there where I hadn't written an article on the site. I've been so busy with my podcast and building that and everything that, I wanted to let the readers know that, I'm on the My Fantasy podcast. Obviously, I'm on it right now. And obviously, I've competed in the My Fantasy podcast or My Fantasy Sports Talk Fantasy Football League for the last few years, and things haven't gone too well. I've had 2 tough exits, and part of the reason I believe I've had those exits due to the fact that kind of certain players that I don't know much about, or maybe have taken guys that have years in the National Football League over a rookie or over a 1-year pro or 2-year pro. And I made that mistake with Alvin Kamara, which I can't. I was frustrated that I did it once. When Dan does the pick drawing, if I'm picking first, that's who I'm going to take. I'm not going to let him go to another team.
So you're putting him above everybody this year. You really think it's going to be that kind of year? And in the article, you did make a point of Mark Ingram being suspended for the first 4 games. So now that is something to consider. It really is. But you think this guy's going to have that much of a leap in his second year?
I do. I mean, I don't see how his role in the offense would be, dialed down. If anything, I think it might be dialed up. He didn't rush for 1,000 yards last year. He had around 700 yards rushing last year. He had over 800 receiving.
But
the majority of the leagues that I play in, at least,
he probably went in as the third running back on that roster, because you got to remember when the season started, you had Adrian Peterson. So he went into the starting the season as the third on the depth chart.
Right. I wrote that in the article too, that he was a guy that I really liked coming out of college. I remember I talked about this before the draft, and I think he's one of those guys that his actual, encompassing skill set perfectly the team that drafted the success that he had. I mean, there were teams that I played against that had him, and he was single-handedly winning weeks for teams last year in fantasy. So, I mean, if I'm deficient in one area, knowing that I have him and how the Saints use him, it's going to be very interesting.
All right. Well, that's pretty lofty. And so Dan was just talking about how he's pretty high on him too, but I'm not sure how high you would slot him. So Dan, would you slot him 4th then? Is that what you're saying, over Le'Veon Bell? He's really the 4th best running back in the league.
Yeah, you can make the case for him to be top 5. I'm just not very high on Le'Veon Bell this year. I actually haven't been for the last few years, and it kind of bites me. But I'm going to continue that trend. Health, suspension possibilities, contract year, injury prone. I mean, so Le'Veon Bell is a topic for another show.
I'm the same way with Antonio Brown, and he keeps doing the same thing every year.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess you trust Le'Veon more than you trust me there. But with Kamara, yeah, especially in PPR leagues, I think he's definitely a top 5 running back. I don't think I would take him first overall, but I would definitely consider it within, top 5 to 7. I definitely think he's a first round pick. He had over 80 receptions as a rookie in that passing attack. He's lethal. And I actually read an article on Pro Football Focus, which is a great site if you utilize it. It's very high in analytics, and they actually ranked Alvin Kamara as the most probable player to increase his touchdown percentage in 2018 by over 7%. They projected him to increase it. So I don't remember offhand how many touchdowns he had, but they do think he's going to be that main guy. I think a lot of it had to do with the Mark Ingram suspension. So the first 4 games, he's going to be that, probably that main workhorse back. But yeah, I'm high on him. I still would take David Johnson, who I think is just as lethal receiving back. He's going to be guaranteed to get more touches rushing for the Cardinals, and they're similar type of players. But I would take a David Johnson over an Alvin Kamara if I had the first overall pick.
Well, I think Ryan hit on a really good point, is that I think he was drafted into the perfect situation with an elite Hall of Fame quarterback like Drew Brees, and he is such an asset in the passing game as well that's not going anywhere. That's only going to increase. So I think, like we said, he started the season last year, third on that depth chart, really worked his way up to probably 1B really, really quickly, and I don't think that's going to change at all this year. So, but you're right, Ryan. Right situation, perfect place for a guy like Alvin Kamara.
You could David Johnson, guys like David Johnson, guys like Le'Veon Bell, guys like Ezekiel Elliott, Antonio Brown. Oh, here. Antonio Brown, guys like usual top 5, but question these guys too. I mean, you could even make a question mark about Antonio Brown, as in some weeks I owned Antonio Brown in a league last year, and he took a bit to Juju Smith-Schuster depending on the matchup. So it's like just an overall pick player to be a guy that I know is guaranteed 20 points a week in a PPR. And I think Alvin Kamara is guaranteed to get possibly even more than that based on his performance last year and his workload.
So let's bring the fans of My Fantasy Sports Talk back into it. We got a comment for you, Ryan. And I think we're having a little bit of audio issue with a little bit of delay there with you, Ryan, but so we'll try to keep up. So this one comes from Boone Robinson, Ryan, and his comment is, I would only draft Alvin Kamara number 1 overall if I wanted to lose and was half in the bag. Change his mind. We'll kick it. We'll swing it back to Dan because I don't know what the hell's going on anymore.
Yeah. So for those listeners who have been a long time listener, you probably know Ryan Thomas is the technical issue guy. So that's just going to continue, I guess. But Brandon, I was mentioning that eject button that we learned, so we can eject him. But I think he's going to join us in a second. I like the kind. I mean, I think. Ryan's going to attempt to change this guy's mind. It's going to be hard to do with some of the other names out there. I mean, like I said, I'm very high on Kamara, but number 1 overall, that's a pick that you do not want to miss on, because in most drafts, it's going to be a snake draft. So you're waiting, 20 picks until you
have to get the home run.
You have to get it. You have to get that guy. And not saying Alvin Kamara isn't going to be a home run. He very well could be.
I think there's several guys that really could be that guy. Like, you're high on David Johnson. There's no way in hell I'm taking Alvin Kamara over Ezekiel Elliott. No way in hell.
Yep. And I'm a Cowboys fan. I didn't even mention him. But what's happening now in fantasy is it's becoming more of a running back. When I started fantasy, 15 years ago, you needed to get your running backs early and often to be successful because it was more of a running league. Now, over the last 5 years, it's become more of a passing league. So taking a wide receiver in the first round has become that kind of sexy thing to do. But now there's so many talented running backs, and they're being utilized in so many different ways. The Saints lined Alvin Kamara up in the slot at times, moved him all over the field to be successful. So he's more than just a running back. So
it's kind of what happened in Green Bay with like Devontae Adams. It's hard to really know what position he plays because he does it all, and they were still trying to figure that out when he broke onto the scene.
Yeah. So I mean,
Montgomery. I'm sorry. I think Ty Montgomery's who I really meant.
Yes. So you see these offensive kind of getting these athletes more than positional players in the draft, and they're kind of just using them like toys. Just a sleeper guy. This is going way off topic, but in that type of role, who I think might have a big season is Tavon Austin in Dallas. They traded for him during the NFL draft, plan to move him to a running back, and he's going to be a kind of a scat back role. So he's a guy that I'm keeping my eye on in fantasy drafts, maybe a very, very late round pick that might be utilized finally in a way that he can be successful. The Rams didn't know how to use him. Their general manager, Les Snead, came out and said, we tried every way possible. So maybe Scott Linehan in Dallas can find a spark for him. But that's a good way off topic. What do you think about Tavon Austin there?
What I do like that, and it seems to me like when Tavon Austin was in the Rams, and he's been in the league now 4 years now. I mean, he's no spring chicken anymore. He's been around a while, but he was a definite weapon coming out of college. So it seems to me like he had some of his bigger games when they would use him on sweeps and end arounds, in the running game.
Yeah. I mean, he's that type of athlete where probably having him in the backfield is going to help him find more success. I mean, if you put him out wide and he's getting jammed at the line, he couldn't beat press coverage worth a lick. I mean, a ham sandwich can do better beating press than Tavon Austin could. So I'm intrigued on how they're going to use him. Obviously, they don't need to give him the ball a ton of times. You still have Zeke there, and even some other guys ahead of him on the depth chart. But I think you're going to see him kind of tinkered in certain ways.
Yeah, no reason why he can't play a role like a Wes Welker, Julian Edelman in that Cowboys system, and even actually get legit touches running the ball as well. But yeah, I think it's quick screens, some end arounds, some sweeps. I think that will work really good with Dak Prescott, because I think Dak Prescott is the type of quarterback that can start pulling that stuff off, and it's definitely be an interesting new wrinkle in that Cowboy system. So, look forward to that. That'll be interesting. But another guy that kind of fits that role, I don't know necessarily getting running touches, but definitely a dynamic weapon. What about Anthony Miller, my boy, Chi-Town?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think he's definitely going to be a receiver in that offense, and he's probably I would shoot him right up to the top of that depth chart. I mean, they signed Allen Robinson. They have some other players there, but Anthony Miller's a playmaker. You saw that at Memphis, and I think you're going to see him work hard because that's what he does, but he's going to work hard this offseason in training camp, developing a chemistry and connection with Mitch Trubisky. And that Chicago offense, as much as we picked on the Bears for them moving up one spot to expect to draft Trubisky in 2017, they're building something there. I don't hate that offense. I mean, they got two great backs, kind of that pounder in Jordan Howard, and the receiving back in Tariq Cohen. And now they're getting weapons on the outside. You add Allen Robinson, you draft Anthony Miller. I like what they're doing there.
Trubisky looks like the type that he's going to continue to learn and get better and be a solid quarterback. It's solid, not a Carson Wentz, but just a really solid quarterback. Not really an issue.
No. So it might take some time. Not saying they're going to be a playoff team, this year or next year, but they're growing to that. So you can see the type of development that they're putting into that roster, and they're going to have some fantasy studs, I think, in 2018. Anthony Miller being one. I would take him and Michael Gallup. We talked about it, in a previous episode. I would put them very close to being at the top of the list for rookie receivers this year in fantasy.
So here's what I got to figure out, Dan. I got to figure out before our draft just how high you're willing to take Anthony Miller, because I think me and you may be a couple of the only guys going to be in our league, maybe the only two guys that are really clued into who Anthony Miller is and what he may do from the get-go. So I got to figure out just how high you're willing to go for Anthony Miller. This going to be, I'm going to have to put some thought into that. Maybe like the Nick and Judy show +1 now, Nick and Judy +1 show, reaching for Ohtani way up before. I swear I was one round away from picking Ohtani. I was about to reach for him, and I'll be damned if Nick and Judy +1 didn't go ahead and steal him. So we may see something like that in the fantasy football draft from you and I. Who's going to bite first on Anthony Miller?
I'm going to take him in the first round. So
go for it.
Go
for it. But anyway, I don't know what Ryan is doing. So we'll see if he can get back and respond to Boone Robinson and try to change his mind on why Kamara even has a shot at being the number 1 overall pick. But let's move on to the second part of this. This is from George Reed. Rank these quarterbacks in fantasy football next year. He gives us Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Cam Newton, and Jimmy Garoppolo, Jimmy G. So let me just go through mine real quick, and then you can respond to the way I finish my list.
Can't wait.
So I'm going with Aaron Rodgers, number 1. I just still think he's just a bad man. Injury free. I think he's going to be the guy, Devontae Adams, Randall Cobb there. And they did add Jimmy Graham. he's just going to sling it. That's what he does. This running game does not scare me there at all. Rodgers has to be in that conversation. I'm going to have Garoppolo number 2 just because I think he's going to sling it, man. I just think they're going to sling it, and I'm not really concerned with their running back game of Jerick McKinnon and Matt Breida. He's going to sling it to whoever he's got. I think they want to show off their new weapon, and what he showed the last 6 games when he started shows that they have a legit quarterback there. So I like him if we're throwing him in there. Cam Newton, actually, believe it or not, Dan, finished second in the fantasy football scoring for quarterbacks in our league last year. Didn't really know it. I didn't think he was going to be that high, but he finished second. You know who number 1 was? A guy you're not high on at all, but Russell Wilson finished number 1. But anyway, Cam Newton finished ahead of Tom Brady last year. So I'm going to say he's going to do it again this year. So I got Tom Brady 4th, which may even slide further you can show this right here. I'm going to show you where Tom Brady's going to end up right there, Dan.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, you even put red? Is that printed out? That's not even handwriting. You printed that bad boy.
No, that. You see that asterisk there? You see that asterisk? Yeah. I hope everyone at home can see that.
Asterisk means false.
Asterisk IR. What is it? Incomplete. Incomplete season. It's going to happen this year at the age of 43.
Yeah. I don't even know how to okay. That's good.
You got to the eye test. The eye test tells me Tom Brady cannot continue to do that. He took a beating last year. But anyway, yeah, that's how I'm ranking it. Aaron Rodgers, Jimmy Garoppolo, Cam Newton, and Tom Brady. Now let me hear what you got.
Well, we did agree on one, and that is our number 2 quarterback. I do have Jimmy G number 2. I agree with you. I think they're going to throw a lot. They're going to throw often, and they have some decent receivers. They drafted Dante Pettis, who I'm really high on. Marquise Goodwin. Yep, Pierre Garçon, Marquise Goodwin had a career year last year. So, yeah, I like it. George Kittle is an underrated tight end. Sleeper fantasy now that Hunter Henry is out for the year. I was
sad to see that. That's a big blow. I hate that.
Yeah, that's tough for the Chargers. Because the Chargers, if you look at their roster, I mean, they are talented defensively, offensively. I mean, they have a chance to compete for the AFC West for sure.
But that's why you don't fantasy draft in April, May, June, or July, folks. Get out of here with that. That early drafting is some nonsense.
Yeah, that hurts. I do like Jimmy G and what he's going to do fantasy-wise, so I have him 2 on this list. We'll just jump to 1 and get it done with. Tom Brady, I have number 1. Number 1, and I'll tell you why. He's Tom Brady, and the Patriots are going to throw the ball. They drafted Sonny Michel, so they're going to have a running game. That's just going to open up his
what I noticed today, man?
Even more.
Sonny Michel has already moved up to number uno on the depth chart as of right now, what's listed, according to CBS Sports. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they drafted him in the first round for a reason, and they're going to use him not only in the running game but in the receiving game. It's only going to help Tom Brady, and they're going to throw the ball, and hopefully they short up some of their offensive line needs in the offseason. They did lose some depth, but they drafted well and made some signings. So Tom Brady's number 1.
Dwayne Allen, so when Rob Gronk goes down every other week.
Yep. So Tom Brady 1, Jimmy G 2. I have Aaron Rodgers 3rd, coming back from the collarbone. You say he's completely healthy, but it's not the first time that he's hurt a collarbone. It's not the first time he's missed double-digit games in a season. So that worries me a little bit with Rodgers. He's probably the most talented fantasy-wise of the group, and should be number 1.
They have the most accurate gun of any quarterback I've ever seen. I mean, his pinpoint laser precision is insane.
Yep. But I'm not sold on his weapons. I do like Devontae Adams. Randall Cobb is old.
Yep.
He's not really effective anymore. They have a bunch of rookies, Jamon Moore, Equanimeous St. Brown. I don't like it. Jimmy Graham, yeah, that's great. He wasn't really anything in Seattle, so it all depends on how you're going to use him.
That was because it was under Russell Wilson. I think if there's anybody who is elated and just ecstatic to change teams, it's Jimmy Graham, because that was just never a good fit in Seattle with Russell Wilson trying to rely on him. But Aaron Rodgers is it's going to be big for Jimmy Graham.
Yeah, I don't see that. Aaron Rodgers has never really done very well with his tight ends. You can mention Jermichael Finley and some other names, but they never really put up eye-popping numbers. And if, according to what you just said, Russell Wilson was the number 1 fantasy quarterback last year, and he still couldn't get Jimmy Graham some points.
Because it was with his legs. He was running for his life and getting yardage that way.
Yeah, so I have Rodgers third, and Cam Newton I'm going to have fourth. I don't like the weapons that they have. If Devin Funchess is your number one receiver, you're going to have issues. I'm not a huge fan of DJ Moore, who they have in the
You
draft.
mentioned
I
that.
was actually pretty low on him coming out. That wasn't the consensus. A lot of people like him. He's a body catcher. He catches it like this. If you're having Cam Newton throw bullets, you got to use your hands, and I didn't see that on tape, so that worries me a lot. Christian McCaffrey's a nice piece, but I'm not sold on Cam Newton continuing to elevate his game. He may have ended at number 2, which I'm actually very surprised at that. But there were some games, especially early in the season, where he was only throwing for 120 yards a game. I mean, he looked like Tyrod Taylor out there. I'm not sold on Cam Newton. I have him fourth. But Jimmy G, I'm high on him. I think he's going to have a good year, and San Francisco is going to they're going to throw the ball. Kyle Shanahan knows how to get quarterbacks going. I envision a similar Matt Ryan type of season from him fantasy wise.
Yeah, they're going to run with Jerick McKinnon and Matt Breida just enough to not be so predictable, and that's about it. But yeah, I was surprised by our rankings from last year too. We're not ranking. That's how the officially the end of the season stats worked out, because I had in my initial assessment had Cam Newton number 4 with Tom Brady ahead of him. But when I looked at that and saw that he was actually number 2 last year, and I was like, well, I'm not going to put him under Tom Brady again this year because he finished ahead of him last year. And how long is Tom Brady going to be able to keep doing this? I think we differ in opinions there quite a bit, but. We'll see. We'll see how it works out. But great question. Appreciate that one, George Reed. I think we're going to move on, Dan. We'll probably have to get a response for Boone Robinson a little bit later, get a written response from Ryan Thomas on why.
Written apology.
He needs to apologize for us. These technical issues. I don't know what happened with our boys tonight, but Orlando had technical issues and Ryan Thomas had technical issues. But at least Ryan Thomas was able to surface for a brief period of time. And start to explain his answer there of why he would have Alvin Kamara number 1. But that article is up on myfantasysportstalk.com right now from Ryan Thomas with the first overall pick in the Thomas Take selects. Apparently Alvin Kamara. So I'm glad to have people like him in our league, Dan. You pick Anthony Miller in the first round, and he picks Alvin Kamara with his first pick. I think I like my chances. I like it a lot. But that's it. Another podcast in the books. Great fantasy football talk, man. In May.
Yeah. I mean, myfantasysportstalk.com. That's what we do. So definitely check out the site, check out the Facebook page, and go to our YouTube channel and hit subscribe. And you'll get the newest My Fantasy podcast alerts whenever we come out with a new show, because we're coming out with more than just one a week now, Brandon. I mean, you're the one editing it. You're the one making us all look pretty. Look at that.
Wow.
And so that we're bringing out more content every single week and just randomly. So we'll just pop out a 30-minute show on a Thursday morning, and you're going to be like, holy crap, sweet.
Yeah, I just saw a new one Tuesday. Now, here these guys are 2 days later with a brand new show. I mean, these guys are amazing. But also, a little secret, if you subscribe to that YouTube channel, as Dan was just saying, then you're going to get the sneak peek. You're going to be one of the first cuts of seeing My Fantasy podcast before we can even drop it to the website and Facebook. So you'll be right there for the premiere and one of the first few people to actually see the podcast. So subscribe and get notifications. So appreciate you for joining us. Hey, you also probably noticed some of the sites we're starting to implement a few new graphical and just visionary sites to the change, Dan. I kind of like the way it's looking.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of it is thanks to you, Brandon. Brandon's a do-it-all, jack of all trades. He fails eye tests, but he can make a pretty sweet logo. So check out the site. It's right there right away when you see it. That is courtesy of Brandon Reed. And then I'm on just the back end trying to make it. It's kind of like a puzzle. You just kind of click buttons and see what happens. And we're clicking buttons
and all that.
Yeah, on My Fantasy Sports Talk. So definitely check out the redesign. More changes will be coming. In the top right, we now have a video section. You can watch all of our videos on there. But a lot of new things are going to be happening over the course of the next month or so on MFST. So definitely check it out.
Check it out. Multiple podcasts per week. We appreciate you. Keep submitting your fantasy questions, your mailbag questions. Keep submitting your topics because we will probably cover them on My Fantasy Podcast from myfantasysportstalk.com. Hey, we're going to get out of here before Ryan Thomas probably tries to sneak back in here. So we're going to cut it. For my co-host, Dan Shawcon, Brandon Reed. Till next time, podcast peeps. Peace.